Hi, Brittyn. Welcome to the Autism Little Learners podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
I'm so excited to have you. And we were talking a little bit before we hit record here. And it makes me think of all of my former students who have had challenges or issues or limited diets, picky eating, whatever you want to call it. And I just think back to if I had a lot of this information 25 years ago, it would have been so helpful. So I'm so happy you're here to give all your awesome information to educators.
Thank you. I'm really excited. As I was saying, I typically give this kind of information to parents, but it's especially important for educators because then this trickles down to many, many parents to be able to understand more about this process and how to support their child. So I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what brought you down the path to specializing in autism as a dietitian? Because
Yeah.
it's really unique.
Yes, it's very specific and I love what I do. So, yes, I'm a dietitian, specialize in kids on the autism spectrum. And more specifically, I specialize in selective eating and how to expand the diet for kids because we know that many, many kids have sensory aversions and or sensory processing disorder, and it can make eating really difficult or trying new things really difficult. And we can go into that in a second. But it's really important to be able to have somebody on your team to be able to say, okay, how are we going to help your child meet their nutritional needs, but also respect their sensory needs? Because I think a lot of times that's the piece that is missing. And, or people are looking at it from only the sensory side or only the nutrition side. And so we really need the marriage of the two to come together for us to really have success with nutrition for autism. And as dietitians, we don't get this kind of training in school. It really takes some kind of personal connection for you to dig deeper into this. And for me, that's my brother Barrett, and he was diagnosed when he was 2 years old, and he's now 29. And Barrett was always a selective eater. He had a limited number of foods. He had like 5 foods that he would eat, and it was Lay's potato chips, Mott's unsweetened applesauce, McDonald's chicken nuggets and French fries, and then the one very particular type of yogurt. And so those were his foods growing up. And I never really, I mean, it was all I knew, but I never fully understood, like, why doesn't Barrett eat the same foods as me? And I think as I grew up, I learned more about, like, okay, there is so much wrapped up in the sensory side for him. And my mom was, a trailblazer when it came to nutrition for autism. I mean, this is like the late 90s. So even still, we don't have like all the resources and education around this. We have a good amount of research actually, which is really exciting. But she had him in feeding therapy and OT and speech and worked with a dietitian. And he was able to expand his diet. He still has somewhat of a limited diet, but he's come a really long way and, helped him get nutrition through supplements as well. And it totally changed his life. And so it's really neat to be able to support parents through this because it's really overwhelming and everyone has their own opinions online. And here we have people who are uncredentialed, like sharing crazy information that's just not true. And so I've really found my place of, yes, let's expand the diet. We don't have to be absolutely like, black and white about it either, and figure out how we can nourish your child in like small, gentle approaches that lead to really big changes.
Oh my gosh. I love everything you just said, especially when it comes to like gentle nudges, gentle approaches. And that's kind of what you provide. We'll talk about that later. But also your connection with your brother. Like you saw it firsthand growing up. And the way you said that, like, I never really thought of it at first. He eats different foods than us. And by the way, the foods you listed, yep, I can look back at specific kids and I can list exactly what their foods were, you know? And sometimes they ate one or two things, and sometimes certain kids eat five things, but seems like McDonald's French fries are always on the list for everybody.
Yes, I mean, they just hit different. There's something about them. It's really, I mean, we've all had them. They are
Right.
Yes, right? And their nuggets have the tempura coating, which gives like an extra
Mm.
crunch to it. So a lot of kids lean toward the McDonald's nuggets every time. And it's because they're the same every time. Like
Yeah.
you, it's predictable. You know what they're going to be, you know what you're getting. And so a lot of kids really lean toward that because they know what to get, they know what to expect from the experience.
Yeah, I think that is a super good point too, because I think some of us have seen that visual. It's just an image that was going around, and it said, it had a cracker, and it says, why autistic kids prefer sameness. And it showed a cracker, and every time the cracker tastes the same. Like if it's a wheat thin cracker or a Ritz cracker, it always, you know what to expect. And then it showed blueberries. And
Yep.
one blueberry might be sweet, one might be tart, one might be kind of have a crunch, and one might be really mushy. And that analogy with that visual really has stuck in my brain.
Yes, exactly. I know. I'm trying to think. I'm like, I think that might have been my post that
Oh
was
my
going.
gosh.
It was remade multiple times, but yeah, I mean, either any way you spin it, yeah, processed foods, fast foods, anything that is going to have like some really strong quality control around it
Mhm.
that's like produced in mass is going to be the same every time. And so, unfortunately, a lot of those foods don't have all the nutrients that we need. And now I will say they're not void of nutrients. And I think that's a misconception that a lot of people have. They're like, well, this is absolutely junk food, total trash. And then they get on themselves that their child is just, they're just eating junk. And I'm like, you know what? It is providing some nutrition,
Mhm.
not the optimal nutrition, but there is some in there.
Yeah,
And so I think a lot of times, you know, I mean, the internet's hard too. It's
it's
like you got to be the perfect parent and feed your child the perfect diet. And it's hard for anybody, but it's especially hard when your child only eats a few foods.
right. There's so much judgment that goes on around it. I mean, even in classrooms, I've heard comments in the classroom from well-meaning people that just don't understand it the way you're explaining it, saying like, well, look at their parent just sends them junk. And it's like, okay, that's literally the only two foods they'll eat, and the parent wants them to at least have that bit of nutrition, like you're saying. So
Eat.
they're doing
Yeah.
the best they can given this situation where, like you said with your mom, they're advocating, they're trying to figure it out first at this early childhood level. Like figure out their child. They know their child, but they have to figure out how to best meet their needs in all areas. And sometimes it's just picking your battles, and food isn't the battle they want to pick right at that point.
Yeah, and which is understandable because everyone's been to the point where you feel so overwhelmed with information that you can't even make one step forward because you feel like it's all in the wrong direction. And
Yeah.
so I think just because nutrition is so confusing, and so I love to make it simple for parents. And one thing I really stress is we're going to add before we subtract. We're not going to
Yeah.
make any drastic changes because we know that the all or nothing approach does not work well for autistic children. We like these gradual approaches that feel safe, that feel comfortable, that can be expected. And then we also we want to focus on adding before removing because I think what happens a lot of the time, a lot of the like recommendations for diet online is like, you have to remove this and this and this and this. And it's so focused around removing. But what happens when you have a child with 5 foods who's trying to go like gluten and dairy free and all of them are gluten and dairy? You can't just take them all out and expect that the child's going to eat something new. They will starve, quite literally starve themselves, which is, you know, uh, it can be divisive when people don't understand autism and sensory processing challenges, but it's what can happen. And we see these like case studies of kids showing up with these severe symptoms in the ER. Nobody can figure it out. And it turns out it's scurvy. And doctors haven't seen scurvy, which is vitamin C deficiency. And it's because of an extremely limited diet. And these kids who are really malnourished because parents are just trying their best to follow the recommendations that are given to them, which is we'll just stop giving them these unhealthy foods and they'll eventually eat when they're hungry. And unfortunately, that really backfires.
Yeah, and that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you today, because that is something you hear all the time. If you just take the junk away, or what people consider junk or no value, you take their favorite foods away, they'll eventually eat whatever you put in front of them because they're hungry. And I have over and over seen that be not true with my autistic students and their families.
Here's the thing, there's so much trust that's wrapped up in food.
Mm.
And when we stop giving them a food, they lose trust in us, but they can also lose trust in foods. And this can also happen when we try to sneak something in, like, okay, here's their safe food, and we try to like sneak whatever it is in there. Then they're like, wait a second, this is different, and now I don't trust it anymore. And I've lost trust in you. And so and then they end up dropping the food, and all things that are coming with good intentions, just trying to get a little extra nutrition in the diet, then majorly backfires. And so we want to make sure that kids trust food. They trust their caregiver who's like
Mm.
providing the food to them, because that's out of their control to
Yeah.
be able to get that. I often give the example of a client that I worked with when I was a fresh new dietitian, and all he ate was Pediasure and hot Cheetos. Only two foods, very differing like sensory input, which
Exactly. That's why I giggle.
found interesting, but he loved them. Now, they were trying to get a little extra nutrition by putting some extra, I can't remember if it was a multivitamin or something in his Pediasure. And he knew that it tasted different, and he dropped it for a while. So he was only eating hot Cheetos, but then he came back around to it, but he had to hear the seal break. He couldn't drink it if the seal was already broken, because he had so much trust, that was broken during that experience. And I don't want that, to be in that situation. Again, they had the right intentions.
Yeah.
They just wanted to help. And if I remember correctly, it was something that was recommended to them by their PCP, who just didn't know.
Yeah. So smart too of that little boy to know that if the seal is on, then it stays the same how I like it.
Yes,
And
exactly.
and trust. I talk a lot about not with food, but just in general when working with 3 to 5 year old autistic children, building a positive relationship and building trust. And sometimes it comes down to, for me, things like when they're holding their favorite object and it's their transition object or comfort item. And if we take it away, we can break trust. Just things like that that maybe don't seem like as big of a deal to us, but it can really have an impact on the trusting relationship that you need in order to teach these kids.
Yeah, it's really
So,
true.
yeah,
It's really true.
yeah. Okay, so kind of backtracking to the beginning. So many of us that work with young autistic kids, we know that they're picky eaters or have extremely limited diets. And you touched on this a little bit, but why is that? And can you also talk about a word I'm hearing or an acronym I'm hearing more and more? Is it pronounced ARFID?
ARFID,
Okay,
exactly.
yeah.
Yes, I know a lot of people mix up the R and the F, and so we'll say AFRID, but it is ARFID, and it stands for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. And a lot of people are just like, well, this is just extreme picky eating, but there's actually a lot more to it than that. So ARFID is actually an eating disorder. And like in the DSM-5, it is what makes it different than other eating disorders is that other eating disorders, they, you know, a lot of the reasoning behind some of them is their body image. Now, ARFID has nothing to do with body image, and that's one of the qualifying like criteria. So it's actually more wrapped up in extreme anxiety around food, and this could be linked to trauma that happened as a child. So like choking is a
Mhm.
common thing that can lead to ARFID, or an anaphylactic reaction, for example, that a child experienced that could trigger ARFID. This could also be due to severe sensory issues as well. But oftentimes we see that severe anxiety around food. And so I think it is misunderstood. I think there's a lot of awareness going around about it, which makes me like really hopeful that we're able to understand more about this. We do see increased rates of ARFID and autism, and ADHD, kids that are neurodivergent, we see increased rates of ARFID. So I think that it's something that, is really, like I said, gaining a lot of awareness. Now, there's something else called pediatric feeding disorder, or PFD, and these two can get confused often. And pediatric feeding disorder actually more has, there are 4 criteria that really cause pediatric feeding disorder to be diagnosed. And a lot of it can be wrapped up. Well, basically, what I'll say, the diagnostic criteria is eating that is not age appropriate, is basically the idea for pediatric feeding disorder. So, but you can have both. So those are just really helpful diagnoses that I often have parents, I can't diagnose them. A mental health professional would diagnose ARFID. And so it's just helpful to know this kind of information walking into your doctor's office if you have some big concerns about your child's eating, especially if you feel like it's been brushed off in the past.
Mm.
Being able to sometimes speak your doctor's language and say, I've researched this, here's the criteria. We do see increased rates in autism, and, will you please refer me out to X, Y, and Z?
I love that. That's perfect. Being an advocate for the child in a simple way. And I think that information about both of those things are important for teachers because many times we'll be doing an assessment or an evaluation or get one sent to us or medical records. And it's something to watch for if we see that, because if we see that, we know right away we need to talk to the parent when we're planning what they're going to bring for snack or for lunch, that kind of thing, and really be going with what the parents recommend.
Definitely. And food is something I talk to parents a lot about, can be worked into their IEP as well.
Mm.
Like, what are some supports that we can put in place if your child does have extreme anxiety around food, or, gets really overwhelmed easily, like in the lunchroom, for example, and is not eating lunch? That is also, not setting them up for success, because then we start to see these blood sugar drops where they're hangry
Yeah.
and mid-morning or mid-afternoon, and then we start seeing a rise in behavior and a rise in, like, or disruptive behavior.
Hmm.
And it's because they're really hungry, but they can't always tell us that. Hunger can really feel different for every child, and we have a sense called interoception, which is the ability to sense hunger and fullness and the need to go to the bathroom, or your heart rate increasing because you're anxious. And we see a huge disconnect for autistic kids, and so they might not be able to tell you that they're hungry, but
Hmm.
they're telling you in their behavior. And so we
Right.
need to make sure we have the supports in place, because their learning is directly impacted by their nutrition.
Well, and I think when you're talking about that, it makes me think about accommodations and modifications and how easy it would be to write in, that they're bringing their own snack from home. And so it's always parent provided and to not try to get them to eat other stuff. Um, I had a student once who, a couple years ago, who had to eat out of the same blue bowl. And so sending that so we could have her eat out of that. And she actually started, before she came to us, she was at a more behavioral center, and they wouldn't let her bring that. And as a consequence, she did not eat in a full day there, did not eat. And she, like you said, had behaviors, aggressive behaviors, self-injurious behaviors. And it doesn't take much to put two and two together as to she was probably hungry and also couldn't eat because she didn't have her safety bowl. I don't know what to call it, but the
Yeah.
trust is broken.
Totally. Yeah. And we talk about, the sameness and predictability in food items, or like the actual food, but it can come down to bowls and placemats or
Mhm.
utensils and cups that can feel safe to that child as well, that can directly impact their nutrition. So
Yeah,
I think, yeah, that makes me sad to hear.
I know. It was really sad, and it took a lot, transitioning her back into the public schools. It took a lot to build her trust back in adults, like unfamiliar adults.
Yeah.
So it was a tough one.
Understandable. Understandably.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I've also heard you on, so anyone listening, you have to go check out Brittyn, Autism Dietitian on Instagram because she has so many good nuggets of information. And one of the things I've heard you talk about is why we shouldn't just ask kids to just take a bite. Can you talk more about that?
Oh my gosh, yes. I think this is the like one of the biggest things that I just can't get over. And it's so understandable. Again, I come from a place where I truly do understand and empathize with parents who are just trying to do the best. They go on Google and are given advice that is the traditional picky eating advice that is not going to be suitable for their child with additional sensory needs and oftentimes is going to put them in a worse place. So this is one of those things where take a bite and you can leave the table, or take a bite of this and then you can have a safe food,
Yeah.
whatever it means. Now, the problem with this, first of all, there are so many steps leading up to taking a bite, like sensory steps, that taking a bite is one of the last steps. Like it comes right before actually chewing and swallowing a food.
Mm,
And so what happens is that we're skipping over all of these sensory steps, and it is a surefire way to put kids A, into overstimulation, but also B, ruin the trust between you and the child or the food, and create some kind of negative experience with the food. And the goal with food exposures is trying to have a positive experience, of course. And if we can't have a positive experience, making it a neutral one. But we want to do our best to stay away from negative experiences. I've met many adults who have said, I still cannot eat this food because I was forced to eat it as a child. And
mm,
that's what I want to get ahead of. We know better now. And it is, I understand saying, well, just take a bite. If they just took a bite, they'll like it. I understand because that's the quick and easy way. And maybe it works.
mm.
But more often than not, I see it might work in the moment, but it's going to backfire long term. And now you're going to have a hard time getting them to take a bite of anything in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think on one of your reels, I saw one of the steps. I don't know where it is. And I think you probably have a whole process, right? That you would teach people, whether they're a parent or an educator. But one of the things I saw was they had their normal plate or bowl with their safe foods on it. And then a little ways away from that was a different bowl that had just a little piece of something that someone was going to try to introduce to the child, and not there for them to eat, but just it's nearby. They see it, right? And maybe they touch it, but we don't make them touch it. But it's just kind of there, right? Is that kind of, tell me the list of kind of steps or things you would do before you'd get to just take a bite.
Well, there's actually 30, so I
There
won't be able to
are. Oh,
them. There's like 30 plus steps. Oh yeah.
oh my goodness. Okay,
So
awesome though.
yes. So there's little steps and then there's about like 6 big steps. So that goes from seeing it, like tolerating it in your space, to interacting with it, meaning like you touch it with a utensil, or you touch it with something else, just not your hand. Then the next one would be touching. The next one would be smelling, and then tasting, and then eating. So you can see these big chunks where you're like introducing it to each sense one at a time. We break it down and we use them as building blocks. And then within each of those big steps, we have all of these little steps in between.
Mhm,
So, like touching it in the beginning could mean touching it to your fingertip. And then it could mean the next step is touching it with your whole hand. And we make like turkeys, like with, handprints or whatever that might be. Then it might mean touching it to your nose, touching it to your lips, which then leads into like, okay, they touch it to their lips, a little bit remains. And then next they lick their lips. And then we kind of phase into the tasting. So you can see it like gradually goes. Now, I want to say this is not an approach that is something that I completely created. Now, I have my own spin on things, of course. However, there's an approach to eating called the SOS approach to feeding. And I absolutely love this training. It is for any healthcare practitioner, but is really geared towards speech and occupational therapists, who are usually the ones who provide feeding therapy. And it's a sensory oriented way to feeding therapy. And so when I'm, helping people find a feeding therapist, if they're needing one-on-one support, going through the SOS website to be able to locate somebody in their area that has this kind of training. I've seen more
Mhm.
success with this approach for autistic children, kids with sensory processing disorder, you name it. So I do integrate this into my approach along with many other approaches as well. And so this is where that is coming from. To back up a little bit, what you were talking about is what's called the learning plate. And I like using the learning plate instead of a no thank you plate because it starts in a sensory safe zone.
Mm.
So what happens with the no thank you plate is that the food starts on the child's plate, they take it off, they put it in the no thank you plate, and it's over. They've moved it. Now, the child did touch it, or maybe they interacted with it with like a fork or whatever it might be. But it started in a place where they didn't feel safe. It was too close. They move it away. What do you do past that point? And you're like, now touch it, or let's talk about it.
Yeah.
You've already it's over. But
Yeah.
what you can do with the learning plate is it starts at a safe distance. You can control how far away this is. It can be across the room, it can be across the table, it can be right next to your child's plate. And it starts in a place where your child feels safe. We can talk about it, talk about the color and the shape or whatever it might be. If you're noticing that your child is feeling comfortable with this, maybe next time it goes on their plate and they feel good with that. But you got them this positive experience with the food that didn't feel past their sensory threshold. And
Right.
so we're still providing exposures and positive experiences, but when it's in that learning plate, there's no pressure. No pressure to eat it. You can talk about it, but they don't have to touch it. They don't have to do anything. We're just working on comfort at that point. And then you kind of graduate to the steps past that. But I mean, sometimes that's even overwhelming as is, and we have to take steps back from there.
Yeah.
But I really like using that approach because it does, honor the child's sensory needs and threshold.
Yeah. Such a great concept. Um, I feel like that kind of thing would have worked with a lot of my students. As you were talking, I thought about a student that I had in my like third year teaching, maybe elementary level, but he was kindergarten. And he had such huge aversions to certain foods, which you learn along the way. And I think it was so long ago, but I think I had like a lean cuisine, which would probably be make me really grossed out now too, like he was.
Yep.
But he, I think it was heated up, but I still had kids in the room, so I set it on the counter, and he literally took my hand, brought me to it, kind of set my hand on it, like pick that up. And then he
Yes.
pushed me, I picked it up, he pushed me to the refrigerator, opened it up, and like no words needed. He's like, get that out of here, put it away. But then he went and threw up. It was, I mean, I'm
Oh,
sure you've seen kids too, where like just seeing or smelling a certain food is so aversive to them that it makes them gag or throw up.
yeah.
And
Oh,
like
buddy.
that, definitely keep it away. Don't ever eat that in front of him because that's probably never going to be a safe food for him. But yeah, I mean, just think of what
Yeah.
kids go through when it's that big of a yuck.
Yeah. And for kids with huge like smell aversions,
Yeah.
we what you can do to support them with that. And I mean, what I do in my work is yes, we identify where children are at, start there, and then we can take small steps forward as tolerated. But hot and warm foods carry a bigger smell than cold and frozen or room
Mhm.
temp. And so for kids with big sensory aversions that they're gagging, they can't come into the kitchen, they're throwing up, things like that,
Yeah.
starting with or letting the food cool down or like starting with like a more neutral temperature can be really helpful for them as well.
Yeah, that's good. I think of the preschool classroom setting, which is where I was for 25 years before. This year is the first year I'm out of the classroom and running Autism Little Learners full time. But 25 years, I've seen a lot of different adults, personalities, kids with different kind of levels of limited diets. And so sometimes we have kids that are maybe attending a program, like you said, like SOS or with a OT or SLP, and working on expanding their diet. But most kids are not. So maybe in a classroom each year, there's maybe one child. And can you speak to the importance of talking to the child's parents to make sure we're supporting what they want, whether their child's in a program or not? So some families might be just so thrilled that their child's eating three different foods right now, and they know if we start pushing it more at school, it could set their progress back, whether it's official progress medically or just something they've done at home.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it's important to talk to the parents because some might be like, yeah, I would love it if you expose them to new things. Like, by all means, they're more comfortable at school if they see other kids eating, like, great. But in in the case that especially they're in some kind of feeding program, we want to make sure that we're allowing the experts to do the work. And so there may be a specific approach that they're responding to or something that they're working on. And, if let's say that we do use some kind of approach that then makes them lose trust in food or causes a negative experience with food, then we're going to put them, set them back of the work that they've been doing.
Mhm.
And so, again, great intentions by educators who are just trying to help. But if you don't have that kind of feeding training and can understand, the ins and outs of feeding and the sensory oriented approach, and um, I say it's better not doing it because unfortunately you can really set a child back. And
Mhm.
this is I'm not just like singling out educators. Like,
Right.
I have colleagues, um, well, none that I know. Okay, other dietitians that I hear of, or people come to me and they're like, I'm so disappointed because I worked with a dietitian. She told us to take this step and we lost a few safe foods. And I was
Mm.
like, were they trained? And they're like, no, they did picky eating, but they didn't know autism, but they said they could help. And I'm like, oh, they
Yeah.
didn't have the right training. And so it can really, it just, my heart goes out to the parents too. So it's
Mhm.
important that we talk with the parents, we get approval, but also like I think it's also important for us to know our boundaries and as educators, as professionals, that there are other experts that do each of these roles for a reason.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't try, like, for example, like oral motor issues are a major cause for selective eating. I would never like say, okay, open your mouth. Let me like evaluate you for oral muscle tone and the way that your tongue moves and the way that you chew your food and your palate. Like, I have no idea. And I would be totally crossing a line trying to do that. And that's not my area of expertise, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think it's important also knowing your boundaries on what kind of services you provide and what you're there to do, and like referring out to the experts so that you're also doing no harm to this child.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think of support staff that we might have. I think everyone usually is coming from a good place. And when you talk about traditional approaches for picky eaters versus autistic kids with a limited diet and how different they are, and how if you use an approach for picky eaters in general, it can backfire and lead to a loss of safe foods, a loss of trust. Like that's the point. I think that's a really huge point in the classroom is how would you recommend talking to, let's say, a staff, whether, let's say I'm a speech language pathologist. I want to talk to my paraprofessionals. I want to talk to the OT, PT, whoever's working with the student in particular. What what could I say to kind of let them know in general about what we're talking about and why the typical approach to picking eating isn't the best? Like, what would be an
Yeah.
easy way to say that?
I mean, I first of all, I mean, the approaches that we use, even very sensory oriented, are very individualized.
Yeah.
Different approaches are going to work better for different kids, and it's really evaluating, okay, what was the response to this? What were the steps that led up to this? Trying to understand, okay, where's the child coming from? What are their sensory needs? What are their sensory thresholds? What are their aversions? Like,
Mhm.
there's so much to understand. And so it's not always that there's like this one size fits all approach. I mean, that doesn't work in general for kids, but especially for autistic kids, we really have to individualize. And so I think understanding that if this worked for one of your students, that doesn't mean it's going to work for this child. Or if it worked for your own child and that was the way you parented and it worked well for you, that could mean it could totally backfire on, this child. And so I think that it's important understanding that it is an individualized approach that we have to follow, but also, this child has additional sensory needs, and the typical picky eating approaches are not, they don't take that into consideration at all.
Yeah.
And you're more likely to take steps backward than forwards.
Yeah. That's a good point. I think even just delineating between, like you said, how we would parent or teach eating to a typically developing child or someone that's a picky eater versus autism. It's like a whole different approach.
Yeah.
And so it
Yeah.
can be kind of hard to explain that, but
Yeah.
that helps. Thank you.
One thing I think you might find this interesting. So, the autistic community actually has started being more clear around that they don't prefer the term picky eating. And that was a big shift for me because that's the term that we use is
Right.
picky. And the reasoning behind this is because it's not just choosing it's not a choice. And so they actually prefer the term selective eating. And so, I still say picky eating sometimes because it's so ingrained.
Yeah.
However, I've tried to shift my verbiage to selective eating because it does make sense. I completely understand. And I think it kind of shifts the narrative of like, this child isn't just choosing to eat 5 foods. Like, there's so much more ingrained in this, and sensory
Yeah.
reasons, and oral motor challenges, low muscle tone. Like, there's so much wrapped up in it. Gut issues can
Yeah.
also
Oh, yeah.
a
Thank
child.
you for thanks for sharing that verbiage because um, picky eating has a complete like connotation that goes with it. They're being willful, they're being stubborn, and that is absolutely not it in my experience either with my students. It's a whole different level, and um, it's definitely not choosing.
Right. And it's just the term that we've always used.
Hmm.
And then in the UK, they'll say fussy eating. And so it's, fussy eating, the same thing as picky eating. So
Yeah.
trying to shift, that
Yeah.
verbiage. It's hard though. It's hard, when you're so used to, same deal. Like when I was in school, we used person first language, and that was what I was taught and ingrained, and
Same.
have learned from the community that to shift my language. And it takes time to get used to because you're so used to it. But of course, like no questions asked. But it is, yeah, wanted to share
Yeah.
that. Just I thought you would find that interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. And when you talk about person first language, I just talked about that in my podcast episode last week because I talked about like 5 things that shifted in the 25 years I've been working with autistic kids. And that was one of them. And it had been so ingrained for so many years that back then, if we would have said autistic, it would have been a very bad, disrespectful thing.
Yes.
And now it's kind of the opposite, unless someone says they have a preference.
Yeah.
So it was a huge shift and it did not roll off the tongue. Took a couple years for it to become what just comes out of my mouth now. But it took a lot of conscious thought and listening for that.
I would correct people, like when I was in elementary school and like
Mhm.
just being protective of my brother because it felt wrong,
Mhm.
in the moment. But it's definitely, I mean, of course I will always respect somebody's preference
Yeah.
and follow their lead, but it's, definitely my default at this point because we've learned so much about the preferences here. So
Yeah. Well, you talked a little bit also about safe foods. Can you just give a little overview of what that term means? I'm sure people have inferred what it means, but it'd be great to have you tell us.
yeah, so safe foods could also be called preferred foods, favorite foods, but safe foods I find is the most common term.
Mhm.
So, yeah, safe foods would be the foods that your child feels the most safe around. And it, often comes down to the sensory profile of these foods. And the reason why they have these safe foods is because they feel very predictable. They
Mhm.
feel comfortable. Food can give us quite a bit of nervous system feedback as well. When we're eating a food that is comforting to us, this also triggers on our parasympathetic nervous system, especially crunchy foods, which I find a lot of kids prefer. It really triggers on the vagus nerve and our parasympathetic nervous system, which is on our rest and digest versus flight or fight.
Mhm.
And so it really is something that can be biological, that the child is looking to find comfort and calmness and regulation in the food that they're eating. And usually these foods are the same every time. Again, kind of looking back to fast foods, processed foods that are going to have very little variation to them because they know what to expect and they feel very safe. And so that's where a lot of parents come to me, is that they're stuck in these 5 to 10 to 20 foods where they all are coming from a box, and they're like, I know that they can't be getting all the nutrients that they need. I need help expanding. And sometimes, yeah, I always start with the education piece of like, this is why. This is
Yeah.
why they like them. And a lot of times we have like that aha moment of, oh, like I didn't realize that my child had these sensory needs and they were looking for them from food. So we start there and then we match. We try and find foods that are going to have a very similar food sensory profile to the foods that they already
Mm.
prefer. And maybe that's another food coming from a box. And what we're after in the beginning is gaining comfort and confidence around foods. And gradually we can expand outward and we can get fruits and veggies and whole grains, where we can get fiber and protein and these nutrients that are really important for the gut and the brain and the body, so that the child can get the nutrients they need to feel their best. I mean, anybody who's running on empty or with a nutrient deficiency, you don't feel good. And
Right.
so who can work, if I showed up to work every day and I was feeling completely depleted, like how can I focus and how can I do my best work? I can't. And, kids often can't communicate that. And so really helping them get those nutrients from their diet. Supplements can be a really helpful tool as well, that can help kids get those nutrients quicker while we're working on expanding, because supplements can happen quicker than diet. Diet change takes time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't
I
happen
love that
overnight.
you talk about this as kind of the foundation. Like when I'm teaching people, people always want to know, like, okay, what are the strategies to teach this child? And it's like, okay, we got to back up because first we need regulation. We need kids to be regulated. And I kind of feel like this eating piece goes into that. Like, not that it regulates them, but it's such a foundational piece. And then the next piece for me is connect. We need to build a positive relationship and then routines. And then we can teach the things you think of when you think teaching. But you have
Yeah.
to have all that in place first, that foundation.
Yeah, yeah. I have a step-by-step approach inside of my membership that I teach parents. And the like introducing foods section is past the halfway point of what I want them to learn. Like they're like, when do I introduce foods? I'm like, not yet. We're not ready yet. Because which I understand. It's like, okay, I'm ready to hit the ground running,
Yeah.
but we have to have certain things in place first. And so usually we take a look at what they're already eating, like learn from the foods that they're eating first. Let's organize their meals where we use their safe foods to get some variety, meaning we're getting protein and fat and fiber just by like at each mealtime, by combining their safe foods in different ways, making sure that they're getting enough nutrition from mealtime to mealtime to get them through where they're not grazing all day long. Then we
Right.
set in a good routine. I like talk to them about mealtime environment and the language that we're using. Like there's a lot that happens first where we have to lay the groundwork before we start introducing foods so you can see the most success from it. Because if we just start right away, like putting something in front of them and we have no rhyme or reason for the food that we're offering and we're doing it in some completely random way every time, like it's confusing and it's dysregulating. And so there's a lot that has to happen first before we even put a new food on their plate or on a learning plate or in the same room.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think of those same tips could probably apply at the school setting too. And I think sometimes, excuse me, I feel like I'm gonna cough.
Oh, you're fine.
Um, I feel like in the school setting sometimes, or at home too, we try to start with something that is not similar to what they're already eating because you think, oh, we need them to branch out. But I love the idea of starting with something similar.
Yep. I give this example often. I mean, broccoli is one of the number you're totally fine. I was just gonna say it again. I give the example all the time that I mean, broccoli is one of the most common foods that parents want to introduce. And because it's a standard veggie, we get nutrients from it, lots of vitamin C, we got some fiber, we got great nutrients. However, it could not be further from the sensory profile for most kids
Mm.
because a lot of the kids that I work with prefer room temp, beige, crunchy.
Yes.
Broccoli is mushy, green, tree-shaped, has a weird smell,
Pinky.
stinky. Um, and it's like we're not starting from a place that's setting your child up for success. We can totally work there,
Yeah.
but we have to follow like a plan. We
Yeah.
have to have a plan. And I think a lot of people don't realize the plan. There's actually like a lot of planning that goes into it so that parents' lives can be a lot easier. So
Mm.
like before we even start introducing foods, like parents, when they do start introducing, they're coming to the table with like a clear plan of, A, which food am I going to introduce this week? How am I going to introduce this food? And what is the next step from here? And they have like a list of foods that are going to fit their child's sensory profile. And if they really want their child eating broccoli, what are like the steps that we're going to take to get there? And so I love making life easier for us. And so coming up with a plan ahead of time and doing the work for your future self
Yeah.
can then just kind of help you. I won't say breeze through it because it's still hard. Like this is a process that is still difficult. But having the right supports in place and having a professional to support you and having a game plan is going to help you stick to this and see success and have some like systematic approach that your child can predict and like understands what's happening because you're also teaching. You're teaching them how to like new foods, how to try new foods so that when you're not around, they understand the steps that they're going to take if they're not quite ready. Like, ooh, okay, I'm gonna smell this. Okay, I can taste it, but I can spit it out. Like all these steps that you're actually like this routine practice of trying new things over time helps give them life skills as well.
Yeah. Yeah. When you think about down the road, that's awesome. So is this what you do in your membership? Is the Nourishing Autism Collective
Yeah, that's
the name of
exactly right.
it? Okay.
Yep. So my specialty is selective eating. That's why most people come to me, but I also have lots of support for people who have kids that struggle with gut issues, especially constipation. That's the number one gut concern for most parents, which links, goes hand in hand with selective eating as well. Then we also have parents who are joining that are like, my child's not a selective eater. They don't have gut issues, but I really just want to optimize and make sure that their diet is the best it can be, that if they need supplements, they can do this, or if we can do lab testing, like I want to know what to do. So we have generally those three groups of people or some kind of combination. And so, yeah, that's how I support families in my membership. And they can come and we have these individualized tracks where
Mm.
you come in, you take a quiz, it sorts you in there, and it helps you through your biggest nutritional concern. And then I'm with you like every step of the way. We have a community, which I love the community. It is so positive. I think that's one of the biggest feedbacks I get is people are like, I've never been a part of this kind of like such positive community. Like, yes, that's what we're going for because it's hard to be in a community online. There's so much judgment.
Hmm.
People can just be mean, you know?
Totally. Totally. And I think that you saying that about your community, it says a lot about you and meeting you. I can see why now. Like you're passionate about what you do and you truly want to help people make their lives a little easier, their kids' lives easier as they expand and work on their nutrition. So thank you for what you do.
Thanks for saying that. I mean, it does. I want people to feel safe. I want them to feel like they can be vulnerable because this is a vulnerable thing. When your child only eats a few foods,
Mhm.
parents often feel embarrassed or feel judged. And like, no, we're all here. We're in the same place. We're all working on the same stuff. Like,
Yeah,
um, we have a channel in the community where people can just share wins.
yeah.
And it's really cool because the wins that they're sharing, they're huge. However, a lot of people are like, I would have never shared this win because I think that people wouldn't understand the weight of this win.
Mhm.
So, like someone was talking about their child, they licked a new food and they hadn't done that in years. And like we all know that's so exciting. Like that's a big
Yeah,
deal.
that's
Uh,
huge. But the average person that doesn't have an autistic child or child who has selective eating would never understand the,
no,
like you said, the weight of that.
yeah, yeah, it's
Um,
really so.
it's awesome and it has to be so rewarding.
I love it. I completely love it. I started my membership. I started it about 4 years ago, but it's really transitioned over the years to just be even better than I could have imagined. So, this past November, I just completely relaunched it because I just had a whole new vision for what it could be, and it's just been really fantastic. So, yeah, Nourishing Autism Collective is where you can find me.
Awesome. And where can everyone find you? Where's the best place to find you?
Instagram is my home. I
Yeah.
love Instagram. It's the way I consume social media personally, and I just feel the most comfortable there. I have my biggest audience there as well. But you can find me anywhere. I'm on YouTube, I'm on TikTok, I'm on Facebook. Anywhere that you just search, my username is the same everywhere, at Autism Dietitian. You'll be able to
Okay.
find.
Perfect. And I will link everything in the show notes
Yeah,
so it's clickable for everybody. And I just want to thank you so much for being here. So
yeah.
much great information, and thanks for what you're doing.
Thanks for having me. I loved this conversation, and hopefully it was helpful to your listeners. And thanks so much again.
Yeah, so helpful. Thank you, Brittany.
Thanks.